Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the Chair of the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. The difference in some of the media outlets that people are discussing today in public radio is federal funding. So, there's a distinct difference in those two. And I don't agree with stuff that comes off on some networks on television, but we're not here today talking about that because we don't federally fund them. That's people's decision. And it does make us an outlier. I'm glad the United States is an outlier because we have the First Amendment and so when you compare us to other countries in the world, I'm glad that we're free and we have free and open press. But the difference is local, is funding. And it ties into my question because I can't let it go talking about bluegrass. We all know bluegrass comes from Jerusalem Ridge in Ohio County, Kentucky with Bill Monroe. That's where it originated. And if we had vibrant local news that's broadcast throughout the nation, you can hear great stories on WKYU public radio from Jerusalem Ridge and Bill Monroe, Blue Moon of Kentucky. And so my question, I guess, is Mr. Husak, because when I look at this, I have WKYU is Western Kentucky affiliated public radio and their television station as well. And I know the journalists on there, they work hard. I don't always agree with the way they cover me, but I absolutely think they do it in a fair way. Sometimes the stories they do that are fair, and I think that's the judge. If they're always biased against you, that's one thing. If they cover you in a positive way sometimes, in a negative way, and sometimes that's just fair. And so I view it that way, and they're hardworking. And so the big question, it just seems, so we cherry pick evidence. I've listened to All Things Considered several times, and I'll listen to it, and I can see how some of my friends on the other side think they're being fair, but I can tell you just the way that I know the inside of how a bill passed or a bill's moving or legislation or an issue, and I know they're not presenting the information in a way that's even unbiased, not even favorable. They slant it in a way that they want their audience to hear it, and I could see why people, their demographic of who listens to them, because that's what they want to hear. So, Mr. Husak, how does what's going on at the national level affect these local affiliates who have good journalists that work hard? And how are they being, the bias at the national level seems to be affecting people at the local level?
Well, thank you for that question. I don't want to get involved in the bluegrass discussion between Kentucky and Southwest.
You need to turn your mic on. Sorry.
I'm going to avoid the bluegrass discussion between Kentucky and Southwest Virginia.
Well, there's not a discussion, it's fact. But they have good music. If you give Bill Monroe credit, it's fact. But you can't argue with the Stanleys either.
What's been happening at the local level at NPR stations is very interesting. More and more of them are understanding that the market failure that motivated President Johnson to start the public broadcasting system in the first place is affecting their localities. And more of them are specializing in local news. WNYC in New York is one of the largest news providers in New York City. And it's all over the country, Chicago, Boston. But these stations are also having to lay off because their revenues are down because they have to send so much of their money to Washington. So the effect is to make it more difficult for them to provide what the market is failing to provide. What the economists call market failure. When does government get involved? When there's a market failure. We are seeing a market failure in local journalism, and that can be a better role for local public radio, but not if they can't keep the money that we're sending to the CPB.
So I guess you kind of answered my next question. So how would it improve the current audience? What do you think would happen to the current audience if we decentralized it?
What would happen to?
The current audience. What would change in the current audience? Currently, you say it's higher income progressives that listen to public radio. How would you perceive the market or the audience changing for public radio if we followed your system of the decentralization?
Yeah, a very important point to keep in mind about local public radio stations. They're only getting about 8% of their funding from the CPB. They have to send a large portion of that to Washington, a significant portion. But they rely on their local listeners. They face a sort of a market test. They have to make sure that they're not alienating their local listeners. And so they'll be providing something that people want in order to keep their doors open. And that way, they'll be producing programming that, in my hope, will be shared with the National Public Radio Network, NPR, and will reflect a wider, it's not so much a diversity of philosophies and ideologies. I hope that's kept out of the news altogether, frankly. But it would be windows into what's going on across America in a variety of ways. And that way we would hear different voices. And I think it would provide a better rationale for National Public Radio.
Thank you. My time's expired now. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.